My name is Eliza Monroe. I'm 29 years old. And the day my entire family chose someone else over me didn't feel like a sudden betrayal. It felt like the final confirmation of something that had been quietly building for years. Something I had ignored, softened, explained away, until it stood in front of me so clearly that even I couldn't pretend not to see it anymore. And it started, like most life-altering things do, with something that seemed small enough to dismiss. A date written in elegant gold script on a piece of cream cardstock, October 3rd, the day I was supposed to get married, the day I thought would finally be mine. I had sent the invitations 4 months in advance, carefully designed, hand-lettered, each one slightly different, because I couldn't help myself, because I needed it to feel personal, real, something that carried intention instead of obligation. And when I sealed them, when I walked them to the post office, I remember feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. A quiet certainty that this moment, this one, would be different. That for once, I wouldn't be the afterthought, the backup plan, the quiet presence at the edge of someone else's celebration. I would be the center, not in a loud way, not in the way my family understood importance, but in a way that felt steady and deserved and mine. Because in the Monroe family, there was always a center. But it was never me. It was my younger brother Caleb, who somehow managed to exist in a space where everything naturally aligned around him, where our parents' attention, pride, and expectation flowed effortlessly, as if drawn by gravity. While I existed just outside of that pull, close enough to see it, never close enough to feel it. And no one ever said it out loud, no one ever needed to. Because it lived in the way my father introduced him to people before they asked. In the way my mother lit up when he walked into a room. In the way every accomplishment of his was treated like a milestone, and every accomplishment of mine was treated like a pleasant detail. My father, Thomas Monroe, had spent 32 years building a career in corporate finance, a man who believed in structure, in outcomes, in measurable success. And Caleb fit perfectly into that vision, pre-med, disciplined, ambitious, in a way that mirrored everything my father valued. While I had chosen something softer, less predictable, a career in editorial design and illustration. Work that paid the bills but didn't come with titles that impressed people at dinner parties. Work that my father referred to as creative, in a tone that always sounded like a polite way of saying temporary. And my mother, Linda, who had built her life around maintaining appearances, around making sure everything looked exactly as it should from the outside, had never quite known what to do with me, with my choices, with the way I seemed content with a life that didn't revolve around status or visibility. And then there was Daniel. I met Daniel Reyes in a bookstore cafe in Boston on a rainy Thursday afternoon, the kind of day where the city feels quieter, more honest, where people linger longer than they intend to. And he was sitting alone at a small table near the window, writing in a notebook, not typing, not scrolling, just writing slowly, deliberately, like each word mattered enough to take its time, and something about that made me stop, made me ask him what he was working on, and he looked up at me with this calm, steady expression and said, "Trying to make something honest," and I remember thinking, without fully understanding why, that I wanted to know him, that I wanted to be around whatever kind of life produced that kind of answer. Daniel wasn't what my family would call impressive. He didn't come from money. He didn't have a job title that carried weight in the rooms my parents cared about. He worked as a structural engineer for a small firm. He lived simply, he spoke thoughtfully, and he had this quiet certainty about him that made everything feel less fragile, less conditional. Like you didn't have to prove your worth every 5 minutes just to keep your place. And that alone made him more valuable to me than anything my family had ever prioritized. When I brought him home for the first time, I already knew what would happen. Not because anyone had said anything yet, but because I understood the pattern, the way my family evaluated people, the way they measured worth, and dinner unfolded exactly as expected. My father asking about long-term prospects before asking anything personal. My mother smiling politely but not warmly, Caleb barely looking up from his phone. And Daniel, who handled all of it with a kind of quiet grace that made me both proud and painfully aware of how unnecessary their approval suddenly felt. Still, I hoped. I hoped that my wedding would be different, that something about the finality of it, the significance of it, would shift the balance, would make them see me not as an extension of their expectations, but as someone standing in her own life, making her own choices. And for a while, it almost seemed possible. Until 2 months before the wedding, when Caleb got engaged. It happened quickly, almost abruptly, and suddenly everything in my family recalibrated around him again. The energy, the attention, the conversations, all redirected with a speed that would have been shocking if I hadn't spent my entire life watching it happen. And her name was Vanessa. She came from money, real money, the kind that changes how people speak to you, how they position themselves around you. And within days, my parents were invested in a way they had never been in anything related to me. My mother talking about venues and guest lists, my father discussing connections and opportunities. As if Caleb's engagement was not just a personal milestone but a strategic advantage. And then, about 6 weeks before my wedding, my mother mentioned something in passing that at first didn't register as anything significant. She said, almost casually, Caleb and Vanessa are having an engagement party. And I smiled. I said that sounded nice. I asked when, and she said, October 3rd. And I remember laughing because it sounded like a mistake, like something that would be corrected immediately, but she didn't correct it. She just looked at me, not apologetically, not carefully, just neutrally, and said that's the only date that works for Vanessa's family. And in that moment, I felt something inside me shift, not break, not shatter, just settle into place in a way that made everything painfully clear. I reminded her quietly that my wedding was that day, that I had sent invitations months ago, that everything was already planned and paid for, and she nodded. She said she knew, and then she said the one sentence that told me exactly where I stood. You understand, don't you? And it wasn't a question, not really. It was an expectation, a continuation of a pattern that had defined my role in the family for as long as I could remember. The understanding one, the flexible one, the one who adjusts. That week, the responses started coming in. Regrets, apologies, carefully worded messages that all meant the same thing, that they had chosen, that they had already decided where they needed to be, and it wasn't with me. I didn't beg. I called my father once, just once, and I asked him directly if he was coming, and there was a pause, long enough for me to understand the answer before he said it. And when he finally spoke, he said, "Your brother needs us too." And I remember thinking, with a clarity that felt almost calm, that I had spent my entire life not needing anything loudly enough to compete with that. The night before the wedding, I sat on the floor of our apartment surrounded by place cards that suddenly felt excessive, unnecessary, like evidence of a version of the day that was no longer going to exist. And Daniel sat beside me, folding napkins, adjusting details that didn't matter anymore. And he told me we could still make it beautiful, that it would still be real. And I believed him, because he had never once made me feel like I was something that needed to be compared, measured, or justified. The morning of October 3rd arrived quietly. No drama, no symbolism, just a clear sky and a steady light. And when I got to the venue and saw the chairs, saw how many of them were empty, I didn't cry, I didn't panic. I just stood there and took it in, the space, the absence, the undeniable shape of what had been chosen over me. And when it was time to walk down the aisle, I stood there alone. No father beside me, no family in the front row, just Daniel waiting at the end. And I told myself that this was still mine. That this moment still belonged to me, even if everything around it had changed. I took one step forward. And then I heard someone behind me say my name. Eliza. I turned. And what I saw was something I never could have expected. Not in 100 versions of this story, not even in the ones where I imagined everything going wrong. Because standing there was the one person who had never once been part of my family's world. And yet, in that moment, was the only one who chose me without hesitation. For a second, I didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't even fully process what I was seeing, because my mind was still trying to fit reality into the version of the day I had prepared myself for. The quiet ceremony, the empty chairs, the controlled acceptance of disappointment. And instead, there he was, standing at the entrance like something entirely outside that script, like a disruption I hadn't accounted for. And it took me a moment to recognize him, not because he had changed, but because I had never expected to see him here. Not now, not like this, not on a day that had already rewritten itself so completely. Mr. Alvarez? I said, the name leaving my mouth slowly, uncertainly, as if saying it might somehow confirm whether this was real or not. And he gave a small nod, the same composed, deliberate nod I remembered from years ago, from a different version of my life. One where I was still trying to prove that what I did mattered. One where I had taken on freelance work that no one in my family had even noticed, much less valued, and yet somehow, impossibly, it had led to this moment. He stepped closer, not hurried, not dramatic, just certain, and I became suddenly aware of the quiet shift in the room. The way the few guests who had come turned their attention toward him, toward us, sensing that something was happening even if they didn't understand what. And Daniel, still standing at the end of the aisle, watched without interruption, without confusion, with that same steady presence that had carried me through everything else, trusting, somehow, that whatever this was, it belonged here. I hope I'm not too late, Mr. Alvarez said, his voice calm but carrying, the kind of voice that doesn't need to be raised to be heard. And I shook my head automatically, even though I had no idea what he meant by late, because as far as I knew, he wasn't supposed to be here at all. He wasn't part of this day. He wasn't part of this story anymore, at least not until now. I got your invitation, he continued, and that alone was enough to send a ripple of confusion through me, because I had sent dozens, carefully tracked, carefully listed, and his name hadn't been on any of them, not because I had forgotten him, but because I had assumed that chapter of my life was closed, finished, something that had mattered once and then quietly ended like so many other things that never quite find their way into permanence. I didn't send, I started, but he gently raised a hand, not to interrupt, but to reassure, and there was something almost familiar in the gesture. Something that echoed back to long nights spent revising drafts, refining layouts, adjusting details that no one else would have noticed. Moments where he had guided without controlling, corrected without diminishing. You didn't, he said, and there was the faintest hint of a smile. Not amused, not ironic, just knowing, but someone made sure I saw it anyway. And then, as if the day hadn't already shifted enough, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn slightly at the edges, handled more than once, and when he handed it to me, I recognized it immediately, not because of the design, though that was mine, unmistakably mine, but because of the small, almost invisible mark in the corner, a detail I had added to a limited set of invitations I had printed as samples, versions I had never sent out, versions I had only shown to one person. Him. I kept it, he said simply, and suddenly the distance between then and now collapsed into something immediate, something present, something that had been quietly waiting without me realizing it. Because I thought, someday, this will matter more than she thinks it does. I felt my throat tighten, not with sadness, not with the kind of emotion I had been holding back all morning, but with something sharper, something closer to recognition, to the realization that not everything I had done had been overlooked. Not everything had been dismissed as small or temporary or unimportant. That somewhere, outside the narrow field of my family's approval, it had meant something real. I started following your work again, he continued, and now there was something different in his tone, something that carried weight, intention, quietly at first, just to see if you were still designing the way you used to, and then not so quietly, because it became harder to ignore what you were building. I shook my head slightly, almost instinctively, because the version of myself he was describing didn't match the one I had been living with, the one shaped by years of being minimized, adjusted, softened into something more acceptable. And yet he spoke with a certainty that didn't leave room for doubt. You turned down our offer 5 years ago, he said, and now I could feel the attention in the room shift again. Not just curiosity, but something sharper, something that recognized the significance in his words even if they didn't fully understand it yet. And I remember thinking at the time that it was a mistake, that you were walking away from something you wouldn't get again. He paused, just briefly, enough for the moment to settle. I was wrong. Silence followed, not empty, but full, the kind of silence that carries expectation, that holds space for something about to change. We've spent the last 3 years trying to find designers who can do what you do, he went on, and now there was no trace of hesitation left, no room for interpretation, just clarity. And we haven't found one. My heart started to beat faster, not with panic, not with fear, but with something I hadn't felt in a long time, something dangerously close to hope. So I'm here, he said, not just because someone thought you deserved to have at least one person show up for you today, although you do, more than anyone I've seen in a long time, but because I'm done waiting for you to come back to us. He reached into his jacket again, this time pulling out something thicker, more official, a document, clean, precise, unmistakable. A full partnership, he said, placing it gently into my hands. Not a position, not a contract, a partnership, with full creative control over a new division we're launching next quarter, based in New York, backed by clients your family would finally understand if that still matters to you, which I suspect it doesn't anymore. I stared down at the pages, the words blurring for a second before coming back into focus. Not because they were unclear, but because the weight of them was something I hadn't prepared myself to carry. Not today. Not in this moment. Not standing in a wedding dress in front of half-empty chairs and the man I loved waiting patiently at the end of an aisle that had already defied every expectation placed on it. I know the timing is unusual, he added, and now there was, finally, the faintest hint of something softer in his expression, something almost human beneath the composure. But I've learned that the right moments rarely look the way we expect them to. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, my fingers tightening slightly around the edges of the document, grounding myself in something real, something tangible, something that existed outside of disappointment and absence and everything I had been trying not to feel. And for the first time that day, I smiled. Not because everything was fixed, not because the hurt had disappeared, but because something had shifted in a way that couldn't be undone. I looked up, past Mr. Alvarez, past the entrance, past the version of the day that had fallen apart, and my eyes found Daniel, still exactly where he had been, still watching me with that same quiet certainty. And in that moment, I understood something with a clarity that made everything else fade into the background. I had spent my entire life being asked to understand, to adjust, to make space for other people's choices. But standing there, holding something that represented everything I had been told, didn't matter. Looking at the one person who had never once made me feel like I needed to earn my place beside him, I realized that this was the first time no one was asking me to give something up. This time, I got to choose. And I did. I handed the bouquet to the nearest chair without looking, without ceremony, without hesitation, and I took a step forward, then another, closing the distance between myself and the only future that had ever felt entirely mine. Mr. Alvarez stepped aside. Daniel smiled. And just like that, the day that was supposed to break me became something else entirely. Something no one in my family had planned for. Something they wouldn't understand until it was far too late. We said our vows without interruption, without spectacle, without the kind of audience my family had always believed was necessary to make something meaningful. And yet it felt more complete than anything I had ever imagined. Because every word spoken that day wasn't diluted by expectation or performance. It was grounded, intentional, chosen. And when Daniel took my hands and looked at me like there had never been a question, like there had never been a comparison, like I had always been enough exactly as I was, I realized that everything I thought I had lost that morning had simply been replaced by something infinitely more honest. There was no grand applause when we kissed, no crowded room rising to its feet, just a small circle of people who had stayed, who had chosen to be there without obligation. And somehow that made it louder, more real, more permanent. And as we walked back down the aisle together, not as a performance, but as a quiet exit from one version of my life into another, I didn't look at the empty chairs again. I didn't count who hadn't come. I didn't measure the absence, because for the first time, absence didn't define the moment. The reception was smaller than planned, simpler than designed, but it unfolded with a kind of ease that no amount of control could have manufactured. Conversations that weren't forced, laughter that didn't feel rehearsed. And at some point, between a half-finished glass of champagne and a conversation I don't even remember the details of, my phone started vibrating in my hand. Once, twice, then continuously. A steady stream of notifications that I had been expecting without realizing I was waiting for them. I stepped outside when it became impossible to ignore. The late afternoon light, softer now, quieter, like the day itself was settling. And when I finally looked down at the screen, I saw exactly what I knew I would. Messages layered on top of each other. My mother first, then my father, then numbers I hadn't seen in years, relatives, acquaintances, people who had made their choice earlier and were now suddenly reconsidering it. "What happened?" my mother's message read, followed by another and another, each one slightly less composed than the last. "Why are people calling me asking about you? What is this about New York? Eliza, answer me." I didn't respond. Not immediately. Because for once, the urgency wasn't mine to carry. A voicemail came through next. My father's voice, controlled at first, measured in that way he had perfected over decades. But beneath it, something unfamiliar. Something closer to uncertainty than authority. "I just spoke to Richard Hayes," he said. And even recognizing it as someone whose opinion had always mattered in his world, didn't move me the way it once would have. "He mentioned a partnership, said your name came up in a meeting this morning. I don't understand what's going on here." I almost smiled. Not out of spite, but out of clarity. Because suddenly it all made sense to them. Not the years, not the quiet persistence, not the work I had done when no one was watching, but this. The validation, the recognition, the external confirmation that translated my worth into a language they had always understood. Another message appeared, this time from Caleb. Short, direct, stripped of the usual indifference. "Did you seriously not tell anyone about this?" And that was the moment I realized something had shifted completely. Not just for me, but for them. Because for the first time, I wasn't the one trying to be included in something they valued. They were trying to understand something I had built without them. I let the silence stretch a little longer, just enough to feel it. Just enough to recognize that I no longer needed to fill it. And then I opened my mother's message again, reread the last line, "Eliza, answer me." And I finally typed back. I did. 3 simple words. Not emotional, not defensive, not explanatory. Because there was nothing left to explain. More messages came immediately. Faster now, more urgent, more insistent. Questions layered over questions. Invitations suddenly appearing where there had been none before. "We should celebrate properly," my mother wrote. "We can organize something next month." My father added, "There are people you need to meet." As if the door they had closed that morning could be reopened on their terms, now that they understood what was behind it. I locked the phone. Not angrily, not dramatically, just decisively. And when I turned back toward the reception, toward the room that hadn't needed to be full to be enough, I saw Daniel across the space, laughing at something one of our friends had said. Completely at ease, completely present, not waiting for me to return, not watching the door, because he had never lived in a world where presence needed to be proven over and over again. I walked back in, slower this time, more aware, more grounded, and as I slipped my phone into my bag, I made a choice that felt so natural it didn't even register as a decision. I stopped waiting for my family to understand me, stopped measuring my life against their approval, stopped translating myself into something more acceptable, just to keep a connection that had always required me to be less than I was. Later that evening, when most of the guests had left and the music had softened into something almost background, Mr. Alvarez found me again. Not with urgency, not with expectation, just with that same steady presence he had carried all day. And he asked simply, "Have you thought about it?" I looked at him, then at Daniel, who met my eyes and gave the smallest nod, not pushing, not persuading, just reminding me that whatever I chose, it would be mine. "Yes," I said. And for the first time in my life, the word didn't come with compromise attached to it. Yes, I'm in. New York wasn't an escape. It wasn't a statement. It was a continuation, a next step that had been waiting long before this day forced everything into the open. And as the weeks unfolded, as plans became real and distances became measurable, my family kept reaching out, softer now, more careful, but still from a place that assumed access, assumed that time alone would restore what had never truly existed in the first place. I didn't cut them off, but I didn't go back either, because the truth was simple, and it no longer needed to be softened for anyone's comfort. They hadn't chosen me when it mattered, so I stopped choosing them when it didn't. And somewhere between a half-empty wedding and a future no one had planned for me, I didn't just build a life that looked different from what they expected. I built one that no longer needed their permission to exist.